bold actions are required to reduce GHG emissions and combat climate change.
October's decision to delay by a year a landmark deal to cut global shipping emissions caused headlines around the world, as well as uncertainty for the maritime industry.
We remain committed to delivering on our emission reduction goals.
It would have seen shipping become the world's first industry to adopt internationally mandated targets to reduce emissions. However, negotiations ended with no final agreement reached, as consensus amongst countries couldn't be achieved. This is Alongside, the podcast from North Standard for the shipping industry. I'm Danielle Jałowiecka. In this episode, we look at the impact of that delayed deal and focus on the EU's legislation to try and help achieve its net zero ambitions, known as FuelEU. Let's begin back in London in October, when more than 100 countries had gathered to try and approve a deal first agreed in April. In and around those talks was North Standard's Mark Smith, Loss Prevention Director, Decarbonisation. Mark, it sounds like that week in London was an interesting one to be part of. Could you share a little more on the political tension in the room and the outcome?
There wasn't much certainty on the decisions which were going to be made. There was, a lot of uncertainty around how the votes would go. The outcome of that was basically the can has been kicked down the road a little bit. In effect, we're going to see delays before the next phase will be coming in, and we'll probably see some development between them. But from what I gather, the next week that followed on from that, there was a little bit of, optimism as those continued to look at how they can adjust the guidelines to move forward with as much certainty as possible under this period of uncertainty.
And so where does that leave the industry in the interim?
With any of these things, it can take time. We're not sure that it's going to be adopted the next year. We need to correspond with our members and discuss with them of what's happened. And the majority view that we can say is that the IMO is where the regulation needs to happen. It needs to happen on a global basis. We need to see that moving forward. Obviously, there was some uncertainty how the EU would integrate with this, and that still uncertainty is carried forward. Countries were against the means of decarbonisation, but the IMO is principally been identified by our members as a method to correct that.
And so what about FuelEU Maritime and its impact?
It means that the FuelEU Maritime, there was some members sitting there waiting for the outcome of the IMO on a global basis, whereas the FuelEU Maritime is the real teeth and the regulation that are now going to bite and take members forward into the next stage. So now members are going to be looking at the FuelEU Maritime to decarbonise, whereas they were perhaps a little bit unsure whether it was going to be the FuelEU Maritime or the IMO NZF or ZNZ, whichever you'd like to refer to it, was going to carry them for the next period. So it also gives us a little bit of clarity as we move forward into this next stage. And we know that over the next year, the FuelEU Maritime pooling mechanism is going to become a big way of achieving decarbonisation targets in the EU and therefore having an onward impact to our members in the shipping industry as a whole.
Maximilian Schroer is the co-CEO of Bettersea. Alongside Gordana Ilic, Max left Maersk in 2023 to create the organisation, which has been recognised for its extensive expertise in the field of maritime decarbonisation and related regulations. Max, the decision to delay the IMO deal has put a sharper focus on FuelEU. Can you tell us more about it and how it works?
FuelEU is a regional regulation and is in fact the first regulation that looks at the emissions in a more comprehensive way. It looks at it from a well-to-wake perspective, so it takes in all of the supply chain emissions of the fuel, and it looks at it from a CO2 equivalent perspective rather than just CO2 emissions. So it also takes in other greenhouse gases.
And why do you think it's an attractive option?
FuelEU is somewhat the first regulation that actually allows shipping companies to monetize their investment in alternative fuels. It's the first regulation that came up with the so-called idea of pooling, where essentially a vessel that is over-compliant with the regulation, it creates what we call surplus because it used alternative fuels, because it used onshore power supply or any winter system propulsion, can then offset an under-compliant ship, so a vessel that just operates as usual on fossil fuels. Before this pooling scheme, the only option to actually monetize the use of alternative fuels was the voluntary carbon market. So here, any book and claim schemes, etc. And I think being able to understand how this pooling scheme works and then being able to utilize it is a real opportunity for the shipping companies to be ahead in terms of maritime decarbonization. And that's why I think this is an attractive option.
And tell us more about the pooling process. How does that work?
The pooling itself is quite tricky. So while it does not come with any technical challenges similar to biofuel, it does come with new challenges for the shipping companies. These are mostly legal and financial challenges. So it's very important that you address this pooling in a strategic way, which means that first and foremost, you as a shipping company would need to think about what is my current exposure, right? So what is my deficit? What is my potential surplus? If I know that, then I want to go on and decide what is my cheapest option to mitigate this. If this is pooling, then I need to, as the next step, find someone who actually has surplus to sell to me or who has deficit and is interested in buying surplus from me. If that is the case, I always refer to this as the simplest problem under FuelEU, finding someone, because it's actually way more tricky to execute such a deal. Because the next step is that when you trade such a surplus, you trade it based on non-yet generated surplus. Throughout the year, you are consuming fuel, you are generating surplus. But this phrase generating is actually misleading because in the end, whatever you do after the trade may still change the surplus you have generated because it is based on the annual fuel consumption and not only what you have done so far. So let's take an example. If you consume 500 tons of HFO now, plus a bit of biofuel, you have generated some surplus. And you can sell it mid-year. But then, if you continue to only consume fossil fuels, your surplus will go down again. So in fact, what you have initially sold will not be existing anymore. And that requires you to have a strong legal and financial framework around it. So you need to create a contract that is waterproof when it comes to liabilities of non-delivery. You need to, in the best case, not directly transfer the money to the seller before you actually know whether the surplus exists as planned. And that you only know by the end of March of the following year when the EU MRV data verification happened. And then after you have done this trade and before it is reported, you would want to track all of this and make sure that if anything happens, you have the option to mitigate it.
So how does a company track it?
It all comes down to data, and that's, as usual, the most important part here in shipping and in emissions management. So you will need to have the right data underlying these tracking functions. And then the next thing is transparency. Often shipping is not very well known for happily sharing data, but here it is very important to have this transparency between the companies that have generated or engaged in such a pool, because only then you can make sure that the pool works out as planned.
Let's take a look now at how the delay to the IMO deal affects the different fuels involved and their introduction. Mark?
Early suggestions, are that perhaps the B100, which were in favour with the IMO system, may not be required with the FuelEU Maritime. But I've seen recent statistics showing that the actual gap in B100 fuels, particularly in the Rotterdam and Europe regions, has actually closed. So therefore, B100 and biofuels may be used. So biofuels in general, basically, is what we're saying. Obviously, LNG comes into favour, and then things, like biomethane, etc., etc. And obviously, this is not necessarily shutting the door on other lower carbon fuels, such as ammonia, methanol, and other technologies out there, and other alternative fuels out there. But obviously, they are a lot more reliant on vessel conversions, whereas, biofuel as a drop-in fuel can be very easily used. LNG has been seen for some time as a transitional fuel, and we don't see that changing. And particularly, and something that Maximilian will probably go into in more detail, is how that's looked into from the pooling environment and, companies building up surplus, etc., etc.
Good points here, Mark. In fact, I think it's worthwhile to outline that the IMO Net Zero Framework and FuelEU were actually different in that case, especially when it comes to LNG. And FuelEU, as Mark already alluded to, LNG creates a certain surplus in the initial years that can be used for commercialization of the surplus, for pooling, for banking, etc. Under the IMO Net Zero Framework, LNG was less favored. So this was also one of the discussion points that we had when we discussed IMO versus FuelEU in general.
So now to both of you, how significant are fuel quality concerns here? What impact could poor or inconsistent fuel quality have on a P&I club and operators?
It's a very good question. And we constantly see that when we go to these fuel seminars around the world since IMO 2020, 5 years ago when we went to lower sulfur fuels. A lot of people put their hand up and say, we don't really see any problems with this fuel. But I beg to differ. As a P&I club, we don't ever get anybody phoning us up or giving a Teams call saying, oh, we had some lovely fuel this last week. It was great, But we constantly get claims that come in. We get to see the bad end of the operations when the fuel is caused delayed to the vessels, delays to cargo, potential sludging of purifier bowls or filtration systems. So we do get to see the problems. And what you've got to remember is when we look back at IMO 2020, that was simply changing from one type of fossil fuel to another. When we move on to this next phase, we're talking about a vast difference in fuels that are used, training requirements, and what it's going to lead to. But if we just focus on biofuels for the minute, we've been saying for some time that we don't expect the biofuel quality concerns to come from, the big tests. We've seen a lot of trials take place, and we know that the quality of the fuel provided for those trials is of a high standard. When we start seeing it displaced across the rest of the globe, and we get, certain suppliers and certain countries supplying lower quality fuels, then that's where there becomes a problem. And we honestly believe that's down to somebody wanting to make a quick buck somewhere in the supply chain. Whenever there's a way to make money and somebody to put a lesser quality cutter stock into that mix, then that's going to drop the quality of the fuel and it's going to lead to potential problems. That's where we're concerned when we look forward as a P&I club, that we're going to expect to see these problems. And it's a little bit of an unknown territory. Even some of the experts out there are still struggling to grasp the VLSFO problems, post 2020. So how long are we going to see the problems continue with biofuels, and are we going to see them accelerate?
From a FuelEU perspective, of course, there has been an uptake on the use of biofuels for the shipping companies, which of course then also increases the probability of such claims. On the other hand, for FuelEU, it is significantly important that the fuel has the right certification so that it can be used to comply with the regulation. And we indeed had customers that unfortunately bought the wrong fuels in that sense, non-certified fuels that could not be used for the regulation.
So let's return to where we started and the postponement to that deal in October 2025. What's next with regards to the agreement on emissions? And what challenges remain in getting more countries to commit to meeting these targets? Mark?
Well, I think that's a big challenge. I think, over the next year, we need to see real focus. As we've highlighted before earlier, our members, which speak for quite a large proportion of the shipping community, have expressed their concerns, over the IMO system being developed correctly and being in place as we want it to be. I think everybody, there is a lot of countries in agreement, if we bar some of the oil-rich nations, they're in agreement with the IMO in principle taking place, and they're agreeing with the method in some cases of it happening. However, things like how the funds are collected, how it's carried out across the rest of the world, still need further thought and development. Whereas the FuelEU Maritime is a little bit more developed in its state, there's a lot more prescriptive there, and it's been thought out a lot further. Whereas the IMO is still in a little bit of development, and that has perhaps caused some of the reticence. I think, at the moment, we have to concentrate on the EU, the FuelEU, how that's going to impact emissions, but really let's hope for some sort of unity on a global basis as we move forward with the IMO. So it's not just impacting ships coming in and out of Europe, but it's having a global impact across the globe.
I think with the delay of the IMO net zero framework, we will see more and more regional regulations coming up, and the complexity of those will be increasing because we discussed FuelEU and EU ETS before. Under FuelEU, you will be looking at CO2 equivalents and well-to-wake. Under the EU ETS, for example, you are looking at only CO2 emissions and tank-to-wake. So here you already have differences in just two regulations. And you do have different emission factors here as well. If you now imagine this happening for 10 different regional regulations, then especially the smaller shipping companies really need to be ahead of the curve and try to understand all of these whenever they go with the ship to that specific country or region.
On this episode of Alongside, we've explored the fallout from the delayed IMO decarbonisation deal and examined how this has shifted attention towards the EU's FuelEU maritime regulation. Thanks to North Standard's Mark Smith for outlining what the next step is for the industry, and to Maximilian Schröer from Bettersea for explaining how FuelEU works, why its well-to-wake emissions approach is significant, and how its pooling system allows companies to monetize alternative fuel use. Looking ahead, Mark and Maximilian warned of the growing complexity of regional regulations and the urgent need for global alignment to avoid a fragmented development of laws and rules. Join us next time on Alongside, when we continue to explore key topics affecting the maritime industry and those who are part of it. Click follow on this podcast to ensure you don't miss an episode. From me, Danielle Yałowiecka, thank you for listening.